things took a very interesting turn over the last couple days. And it's really something if you follow at all the coverage of this in the corporate press and then follow kind of like, some good actual journalists of what's going on there, because this seems to have not really made much major news in America. And you would think, since everybody's changing their, profile picture to Ukrainian flags and all of this, and this is like the number one story now for about a month, that this would at least be somewhat of a story. And that is that this Zelensky character and the government of Ukraine seems to have gone what can only be described as full authoritarian. Have you seen any of this, Rob?
Well, I just to give the full scope of how buried this story was, I read Google News, also the Google News for me. I go through Twitter, Wall Street Journal, The Drudge Report, Daily Beast, Week Magazine. I got quite a few things I read through on a daily basis. I only knew that this was a story because you had sent it to me and I had to go to DuckDuckGo and search it. And there were some mainstream coverage of it, but it was not easily found.
Yeah.
This was pretty buried.
Yeah. And look, it's really something, and we'll get into like a few of the details about this, but it's not, again, like I do try my best on the show to be like, somewhat fair with the stuff we're talking about. None of this means that Vladimir Putin is justified. And none of this means that the Ukrainians don't have a right to defend themselves and to try to repel an invading army. I absolutely think they do. And I root for the war to end as quick as possible. And I root for as few innocent Ukrainians to die as possible or be hurt or displaced.
How much does it just look like we're setting them up for a slower, more painful death? Like the latest news is we're sending them old Soviet Union anti-missile defense systems.
Well, this was an argument that the great Colonel Douglas MacGregor was making since the beginning of this war, that he was like, look, if you have a war where the Ukrainians can't win, a war against Russia, and you're not prepared, and he doesn't look at this like a libertarian ideologue like I am. He's not like an anti-war activist. He's a colonel, he's like looking at this like a military man. He's not like, this is immoral for us to get involved in this war. He's just like analyzing this. And he goes, look, if you have a war with Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine can't win, and the United States of America, you're not willing to enter this war on behalf of Ukraine, then just encouraging them to fight and just sending them weapons and this stuff, this might just be like prolonging and extending this battle that they're doomed to lose. So you might just be creating a situation where just far more Ukrainians are going to die than would have if you weren't encouraging them to fight and sending them weapons. And it's an interesting point that's, whether you agree with it completely or not, is certainly worth thinking about. But look, you can say that, Vladimir Putin is wrong and you hope Ukraine wins the war and that Ukraine has every right to defend themselves and all of this stuff. But if you're talking about this situation and everyone's going to be putting Ukrainian flags up in their profile pictures, and even more than that, the fact that the mindless, idiotic talking point that is just repeated over and over again is how Ukraine is a democracy, and Ukraine represents freedom, and Vladimir Putin represents authoritarianism. Was. Yeah, I mean, well, they really haven't even been for quite a while. Look, they overthrew a democratically elected government in 2014. And when I say that, I just mean an uprising of regular Ukrainian people, like Secretary of State John Kerry and Victoria Nuland and George Soros, just like regular Ukrainians rose up and overthrew their government in 2014. But they overthrew a democratically elected government in 2014. There's no disputing that. So I don't know how many points you get to be a democracy if you overthrew a democratically elected government this decade, within the last 10 years or whatever, then I don't think you get too many. But just over the last few days, President Zelensky has officially banned his rival political party. He has absorbed several media outlets under state control and been imprisoning political opponents which he's already been doing before this war, but doing even more so, even more of that. I mean, okay, now that doesn't mean that any of the other things have changed. You could still be against Russia's invasion. You could still root for the Ukrainians to win and say they have the right to defend themselves. But that is relevant information that you would think, if we were going to be talking about this whole, situation, would at least come up. Again, even if there were two like completely authoritarian countries and one invaded the other one, you could still say that country is wrong for initiating a war against the other one, even all the other factors, putting all of that aside for a second. But this really does just poke not a little bit of a hole, but it just, explodes. It just demolishes the argument of like, well, but Ukraine is this free democracy and Russia is this authoritarian country. It's like, no. Like this guy is clearly going full authoritarian. And none of this stuff is like, oh, this is necessary for the war effort. In fact, his rival political party there, they were opposed to Russia as well. And they condemned the Russian invasion. They certainly, I think, were not as pro-West and anti-Russian as Zelensky's party. But, this is for Ukraine on the level of Joe Biden just using the federal government to declare to make the Republican Party illegal. There's no Republicans anymore, just by state.
Because COVID's such a threat, and they're trying to roll it back. So we're getting rid of the Republican Party.
It would be something on that level. So anyway, it's just like it's a little bit. It's kind of wild to see this go, not unreported, but again, like not getting nearly the amount of coverage that it clearly warrants. Does that make sense?
The articles I had read, it sounded like there were 11 parties that he got rid of. One of them, which was the biggest rival, was a pro-Russian party. However, and I understand like the idea of martial law or like that side is more in line with the invading country. But if I don't know when they next do elections, but if in the next election everyone voted for that party, which is basically hey, let's not be at war with Russia, then that's still a democratic process. Like to remove that other option from the table.
Then so you're not a democracy anymore. I'm not just championing that democracy is the greatest thing ever, but the people who are supporting this war are saying that. So, okay, even if you're going to claim that they're a pro-Russia party, which I don't know if that's completely accurate. They certainly were more. No,
I'm saying that was the harshest claim, but right. even that, that's still an element of democracy that people go, I'd actually prefer the pro-Russian party because maybe they'll side with Russia and work this out.
Yes, that's a good point.
As an option.
Yes. So if, let's say, hypothetically, they were a pro-Russia party and Ukraine is so against Russia, well, then, okay, so no problem. So then they won't vote for that party, right? So what's the issue? And I think the more that you learn about the situation in Ukraine, the more you realize that it's kind of like a very similar thing with a lot of countries, maybe even our own country, that there are different groups within these countries who are so radically opposed to each other that it probably doesn't really make sense that they're all one country. And the truth is that since 2014, the conflicts between the Donbass region there in the east of the country and the more Western pro-European side of this, they've been basically at war with each other. And there really doesn't seem to be any reason why they should all be under one government, because none of them seem happy with the governments that the other one would like. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the Donbass region should be part of Russia. Maybe they should just be independent. I don't know. And it's not my job to decide how Ukraine should be divided up. But it is like, if we're just being honest here and calling a spade, no, Ukraine is not a free country at all. And it's certainly not a democracy. And what's interesting about this, and it's one of the things as you look at this, to me, it seems almost impossible to ignore. It's like the idea of, I always felt like, even back in the day in the original war on terror, that it was always so ridiculous that, Washington, D.C. would say, we're going to go bring freedom to Iraq. or something like that. And you're like, to bring freedom to Iraq, like we have the biggest prison population in the world, and huge numbers of them are there for like nonviolent, victimless crimes. I mean, bring freedom to other people. And to try to, like, maybe if you were operating a truly free society, someone could think you have a leg to stand on, that you're going to spread this freedom around the world. But it's like, well, and it was the neocons, like at the same time that they're like instituting the TSA and the Patriot Act, they're like, we're going to spread freedom. And you're like, well, all right. Here's in the only area that you actually have control over, you're cracking down on freedom, you know? But this is like, after the last 2 years, the idea that Washington, D.C., that the group of lawyers in D.C. That are politicians are going to say, hey, we're really concerned with protecting freedom. Excuse me? I mean, if it wasn't for like a narrow decision in the Supreme Court, the Biden administration would have just, kicked at least tens of millions of Americans out of their job if they didn't want to get a vaccine. What do you mean freedom? What does that word mean to you? Because it kind of means something to me.